You're watching TelecomTV. Hello, my name is Martin Warwick. We're here in San Francisco at the Moscone Center downtown. It's quite noisy in here. There's all sorts going on. 5,000 some odd delegates to the IDF 2014, the Intel Developer Forum. And I'm talking with George Drapeau, who is Director of Partner Solutions and Strategy with Red Hat. George, welcome.
It's nice to meet you.
Thank you. General, easy-going question to start with. How are SDN and NFV transforming the networking industry, do you think?
We look at a few trends. We look at what's happened with compute and enterprise virtualization and how that's given a lot of agility and at the same time making management at scale much easier to do. We've seen the similar thing happen to software-defined storage, where you essentially turn storage into a compute problem. And we see software-defined networking having the potential to do the same thing for the networking world, turning a lot of networking functionality into a compute problem, giving you much more scale and agility, being able to make much more rapid changes in networking, at the same time taking cost out of the equation for customers. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
What about your customers? They live through iteration after iteration of change. You know, Mao Zedong's principle of continuing revolution. Networking is pretty much like that. What do they make of it all?
Well, I think the 5-year plan will be successful. In this case, I think that'll happen. But I think the trade-off is if you're willing to accept some change, and that change comes in the form of innovation, you'll end up being able to run things ultimately in a much more seamless way. You will have not as many different kinds of piece parts to manage, so your management problem will become simpler. Ultimately, at the light at the end of the tunnel, things become faster, simpler, and cheaper for you to manage.
Given that your customers accept that this change is coming and they're willing to embrace it, do they have plans for deploying and testing the new technologies now?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a similar kind of technology adoption curve as we are seeing with infrastructure as a service software and with other enterprise virtualization 5 years ago, where you will see pools of what we call dev test pools starting. So developers and testing units doing some prototyping. Later on, you'll start to get maybe some of your non-business critical applications, but more leading edge services deployed. That will get us time to see how the technology works, work out some of the kinks in it. And I think the next stage of evolution will be heavy duty carrier grade production. I think that's how it's going to go. That's how it seems to be so far.
No, that's the customer side of it, and that's the technology side of it. What about Red Hat? What's your vision, what's your strategy for SDN and NFV?
Well, we're a software infrastructure provider, and that puts us in a good position with Intel. When you're running infrastructure, you have access to a broad portion of the market. You need to be able to make rock solid technologies, and you want to build platforms so that you can enable services to be built on your platform, on your infrastructure. That's where we sit. So what we see is a world where software-defined networking has solid platforms and standards built on it. We favor an open source approach, so we want to contribute open source to those standards, and we want to see virtualized network functions built on top of a software-defined networking framework. If we do that, we believe that partnering with Intel, we can provide the infrastructure for all that to run and make the infrastructure economical and very easy to build on.
You talked about open source, George, and open standards. Those of us who've been around a year or two have seen this again in the past, where there's been great promise for open source and open standards on various initiatives and technologies, which in the end have petered out, shall we say, kindly. Perhaps rather more than petered out. It's been stopped in its tracks sometimes by proprietary standards and by big corporations. Yeah. What's the difference this time? Why do you think there's such momentum behind open source and open standards on this occasion when there hasn't been in the past?
My personal speculation is, if you look at the nature of infrastructure these days, and software being a weapon and infrastructure being a competitive weapon, there is so much compute power that we can throw at business problems these days that it's overwhelming the shops that are running that infrastructure. They just can't scale up. Red Hat calls that the IT innovation gap. The IT innovation gap is the distance between the demand for growing services or throwing more data and compute at a problem to extract business intelligence versus the amount of infrastructure that any group of admins can handle. That budget isn't growing. And so I think there's this huge demand for being able to deal with this gap. The best way to deal with the gap, we think, is to reinvent the infrastructure, and we favor doing it through open standards where many people cooperate on a new form of infrastructure And then we like to use open source as a reference implementation so that other people can see how that innovation might be done, and they can choose to build off of that, or they can choose to contribute to that and just make the place better for everybody.
As is becoming more common these days, smaller companies or different companies are collaborating with bigger companies to come up with solutions. They may be arch rivals in one thing, but they're partners in others. You are in an association with Intel, but you're collaborating with them on the Intel Open Network platform,
Yes.
which has got this name of Sunrise Trail, which sounds a bit like Tucson to me, but you know. So what's all that about?
So if you take one notion, something called service chaining, if you look at what happens in carrier networks trying to assemble a phone call or some other network service, there are usually many components that have to be slung together to make that service happen, the service chaining happen. And what we're trying to do is take that as an example for what the underlying modern platform should look like. If we can make it easy for VNFs to add into that service chain, then we think we have a winnable platform. So ultimately we're doing a couple of things. We're building a prototype environment, a prototype service chain, and we're inviting partners to participate in that service chain and prototype with us. And at the same time, we're trying to build an ecosystem of partners where we can all work together, define how the platform looks, see what it's like for application developers to add their own components to the service chain and really participate in speeding up that whole process. That's really what it's trying to do, demonstrate the technology and then recruit an ecosystem around it.
What's it like working with Intel?
Yeah, it's good. Intel and Red Hat are coming from a similar position. Other people might say we start from the bottom up, and it's hard for some people to see where the value is, but the bottom is where you start. You can't have an atmosphere without oxygen. You can't have a computing universe without Intel processors or without runtimes, which is what Red Hat does. So what we do is collaborate on the software and hardware section for software infrastructure, and we tend to see things very much the same way. Intel has an interest in supporting open source standards to enable as many companies as possible to innovate on top of their platforms, and we're very much the same way. Even though we commercialize it, ultimately we want the technology to be contributed back into the open upstream communities. We see eye to eye that way. It's great.
You have something called RHEL in an industry which is full of acronyms. This is yet another one. I assume it stands for Red Hat something.
That's right.
Must admit, I don't know what the EL stands for. You're going to enlighten me.
Yeah, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is probably our largest selling product. It's our commercial version of the Linux kernel. It's our operating system product. We have RHEV, Rev, the Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization product, and we have RHSS, the Red Hat Storage System. RHEL is the underlying platform for us, one platform, but we have several product lines as we fill in the rest of the infrastructure. Software-defined storage, adding software-defined networking, infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service to speak to software developers in the cloud as well, and do all of that.
So why does RHEL, why is it such a critical ingredient in the Intel Open Network platform?
Yeah, because that's the engine that runs the whole thing. That's the engine at the center of the car. The car is going to have passengers, it's going to have workloads that we're carrying, and there needs to be something that does the dashboarding and the control of the whole vehicle here. That's what the operating system's purpose is. And what we have with RHEL is something that's carrier grade with military security, which I think is more important in this kind of environment.
Sure. What's the USP? What's unique about a Red Hat-based NFV or SDN solution? What do you bring to the party that nobody else does?
There's a couple things. I think you'll hear me say it again and again, we are a strong believer in the open source production model. It's a way of producing software that invites many collaborators in a very open environment that leads to faster innovation. Any customer gets advantage of that, whether they consume the technology from us or not. But I also think if you look at what Red Hat does, we contribute in several areas in the stack. You'll find some vendors who are contributing to a technology called OpenStack, which is prominent in the NFV space, but they don't have an operating system play. Other vendors have an operating system play, but they don't contribute in the infrastructure as a service. And without going into too much detail, there are certain problems in this space where if you're an operator, service provider, you need innovation to be coordinated between those two components. So if you have a vendor who knows deeply about both of those, you win, and we are that.
A final question to you. Looking into the future, we saw over the past couple of years SDN and definitely NFV spring fully formed into the world, more or less.
Yeah.
Right? Suddenly they weren't there, and then they were.
Yeah.
And obviously, the first phase, certainly of NFV, is coming to an end. We're seeing this change from the informative to the normative. We're seeing proofs of concept now. The intellectual idea is behind us. It's now a matter of proof of concept prior to commercial deployment.
Yes.
Where do your plans fit in with that? Where are you along that continuum?
We would like to see experimentation continue. We would like to see the development of standardized platforms for NFV. We would like to see certification programs. Certification programs serve the purpose of allowing a community to decide what is it like to work together in a standardized way. When things are standardized, friction goes down, communication costs go down, things happen more cheaply and they happen faster. So we have a heavy interest in trying to discover what are the appropriate standards in this space and then pouring engineering effort behind them. That's what we'd like to see, development of standards.
Interesting interview. George Chapeau, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.